A single song could determine your guilt or innocence in an ancient courtroom. Long before written evidence dominated trials, the human voice was the ultimate legal tool, a powerful instrument capable of swaying juries and sealing fates. Your ability to speak, to chant, or even to sing with skill and conviction could mean the difference between freedom and ruin. By the end of this journey, you will understand how the art of sound fundamentally shaped the course of justice for centuries. We will uncover why a trembling voice implied guilt and how a perfectly performed melody could serve as binding testimony. What forgotten power do you think our voices still hold today, long before laws were written on stone or parchment? They lived in the breath and memory of the people. Justice was not something you looked up in a book. It was a performance you had to deliver live. In the earliest Roman forums and the gathering places of Germanic tribes, the law was a spoken tradition, a collection of rules and precedents passed down through generations by word of mouth. Elders and chieftains held this knowledge, reciting it from memory to settle disputes. This meant your entire case, your very fate, rested on your ability to speak. You had to present your argument with clarity, with passion, and with a memorable structure that would stick in the minds of your judges. A voice that wavered or cracked under pressure was not just a sign of nerves, it was interpreted as a symptom of a guilty conscience. Conversely, a voice that was strong, steady, and resonant could project an aura of truthfulness and moral strength. The courtroom was a stage where the first and most lasting impression was often an auditory one. This deep cultural reliance on the spoken word, this primacy of orality, created a fertile ground for something even more potent than simple speech. It set the stage for the power of song and rhythmic chant to take root and directly sway the outcomes of trials, a power harnessed by the first true masters of legal persuasion. This art of persuasion found its ultimate expression in the voices of legendary figures like Cicero and Demosthenes. These men were not merely lawyers arguing points of law. They were virtuoso performers who wielded rhetoric as their primary legal weapon. Their entire strategy revolved around the deliberate and masterful control of the human voice. They understood that how something was said could be just as important as what was said. A perfectly timed pause could build more tension than a paragraph of argument. A sudden drop to a conspiratorial whisper could draw a jury in, making them feel privy to a secret truth, while a thundering crescendo could condemn an opponent with the force of a physical blow. They were architects of emotion, using the very texture of their speech to lead their listeners. They employed clever rhetorical devices, though they would not have called them by these modern names. One technique was the powerful repetition of a phrase at the beginning of successive sentences, hammering a central idea into the jury's mind. Another was the sly trick of bringing up a damning piece of information by claiming they would not mention it at all, thereby ensuring the jury thought of nothing else. The entire performance was designed to construct a narrative so compelling, so emotionally resonant, that it felt more true than a simple recitation of facts. The jury was led to feel they were not being told what to think, but were instead arriving at a moment of profound justice entirely on their own. In this world, a trial's outcome could hinge on theatrical skill as much as factual evidence. This sophisticated manipulation of spoken sound to shape legal reality has a direct and fascinating parallel, one that moves from the art of speech to the power of formalized song. This polished oratory, however, was only one path that vocal power could take. While Cicero swayed Roman juries with his cadence, other cultures were composing their evidence into melody. In some African kingdoms and among indigenous peoples of the Americas, song was not merely an accompaniment to justice. it was the very medium of testimony. These were not spontaneous outbursts but carefully crafted legal documents in musical form. A plaintiff would not simply state their grievances, they would sing them, with a designated performer or a chorus presenting the case in a structured composition. Every accusation, every piece of evidence was woven into the lyrics and locked into place by a specific rhythm and tune. This musical structure served a profoundly practical purpose. It was a powerful mnemonic device. The melody acted as a memory palace, ensuring that the intricate details of a land dispute or a broken promise were recalled with perfect accuracy, generation after generation. But the performance itself held legal weight. A song delivered with a faltering voice or a broken rhythm was more than just unimpressive. It could be interpreted as a sign of a weak case or, even worse, disrespect for the court and the ancestral spirits being called upon as witnesses. The aesthetic quality of the song was inseparable from the truthfulness of its content. This reveals a world where the law was not just heard but felt, a world where the very fabric of legal procedure was woven from sound. And this reliance on acoustic power extended even further, shaping the very stones of the buildings where justice was performed. These architectural stages were engineered for vocal command. In ancient Greece, some of the most important legal proceedings unfolded in open-air theaters, where the natural curvature of the stone and the precise angles of the walls acted as a giant acoustic amplifier. A speaker standing at the center point, the equivalent of the stage, could be heard with startling clarity by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of jurors seated in the ascending rows. Every subtle shift in tone, every emotional crackle in the voice was carried effortlessly to the farthest listener. This was not a matter of chance, it was physics in service of justice. The space itself filtered out weakness and magnified power. A confident, well-projected voice would resonate, filling the entire arena and holding the massive jury in its grip. But a timid, faltering delivery would simply dissipate into the open air, leaving the speaker visually present but acoustically absent. A fatal flaw in a system where being heard was synonymous with being believed. The Romans took this concept and built it into their very idea of civic order. The basilica, with its soaring ceilings and vast, reverberating hall, was designed to overwhelm the senses and project imperial authority. In such a space, a powerful voice did not just speak, it thundered. The natural echo added a layer of gravitas, making a single orator sound like a chorus of conviction. Can you hear the psychological impact? To stand in that grand hall, surrounded by the symbols of state power, and listen to a voice that seemed to emanate from the architecture itself, was to feel the weight of the law in a deeply physical way. The design of these courtrooms made the human voice an instrument of the state, and only those who could master its acoustics could truly hope to command the court's favor. This intricate relationship between sound and space raises a profound question about the nature of proof itself. If a compelling performance could so sway a jury, where did that leave tangible, silent evidence? This strategic use of sound reached its most profound level when litigants sang not just to the jury, but to the gods themselves. In the courtrooms of ancient Greece and Egypt, proceedings often began with a solemn hymn, a paean sung to deities like Themis, the embodiment of divine law, or Mat, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. This was far more than a ceremonial opening. For the individuals about to plead their case, it was a critical piece of legal theater. The ability to lead or harmonize perfectly in this sacred song was a public demonstration of one's character. It showed respect for tradition and, more importantly, it visibly aligned the singer with the forces of righteousness and balance. A voice that was clear, confident, and melodious in its praise suggested a soul in harmony with the divine will, framing the singer's entire argument as an extension of cosmic justice. The psychological pressure this placed on the opponent was immense. Imagine the daunting prospect of facing a trial after your adversary has just beautifully channeled the favor of the gods. Conversely, to fumble the words, to sing out of tune, or to remain silent was a grave misstep. It could be interpreted as a sign of a troubled conscience, an inability to stand with the righteous, or worse, active disfavor from the divine powers presiding over the trial. This practice reveals a world where legal strategy was not confined to evidence and argument. It actively encompassed the metaphysical, using collective song to build a wall of spiritual presumption around a case. But if song could summon divine favor, could it also be wielded as a tool to force the truth from a reluctant witness? But what if your only evidence was your own sorrow? When formal courts offered no recourse, people across the ancient world turned their grief into a weapon. From the city gates of Mesopotamia to the chieftains' halls in Celtic lands, a specific and powerful legal ritual existed, the formal lament. This was not a private cry of pain, it was a public performance of justice. A person who had been deeply wronged, often a woman who had lost a husband or son, would compose a song of grief. She would perform this lament at a crossroads, before the temple, or directly at the ruler's gate. The song followed traditional melodic patterns, its contours shaped by centuries of sorrow, and its lyrics were direct accusations. This performance was designed to do one thing: to shatter the peace and compel a response. By singing of her loss in a public space, the lamenter placed the perpetrator and the entire community on trial in the court of public opinion. The raw, audible emotion in her voice was not just a side effect, it was accepted as proof. Her vocal skill and the perceived authenticity of her performance were the evidence. A powerful, heart-wrenching lament demonstrated the depth of her suffering more convincingly than any list of facts ever could. It was a direct appeal to the community's shared morality and honor. If her song was compelling enough, the social pressure became unbearable, forcing elders or a chieftain to intervene and provide restitution. In this profound tradition, justice was not found in a verdict, it was literally sung into existence, proving that the most compelling evidence could sometimes be a melody of pure, unvarnished human feeling. The most binding promise you could make in an ancient courtroom was not just spoken, it was sung. Before any evidence was presented, the swearing of an oath was a performance under immense pressure, a vocal test of character that could single-handedly decide a case. In many cultures, from the Norse things to the courts of the ancient Near East, an oath was not valid if it was merely stated. It had to be recited in a precise rhythmic pattern or chanted to a traditional melody. This formalized delivery transformed the words from a simple promise into a sacred contract, often witnessed by the gods. The content of the oath was important, of course, but the true evidence was the sound of your voice delivering it. A steady, resonant tone, unwavering in its pace and clarity, was perceived as the audible signature of an honest soul. It projected confidence and a clear conscience. But a single moment of hesitation, a slight crack on a high note, or a stumble in the established rhythm could be catastrophic. Such a vocal falter was not dismissed as simple nerves. It was read by the judges and the entire assembly as a symptom of perjury, a lie manifesting in the body and betraying itself through sound. The voice became the ancient world's most trusted lie detector, a biological instrument believed to be incapable of concealing a guilty heart. This profound scrutiny reveals a universal belief that vocal control was a direct reflection of inner virtue. If the very act of swearing an oath was such a theatrical and decisive performance, how then did the voice transform the presentation of the evidence that followed? In a world without law libraries, the most important legal archives were carried not in books, but in the throats of singers. When a community needed to settle a complex dispute, they might call upon the bard or the griot, a living repository of history who held the entire legal memory of the people in song. These performers were not entertainers in that moment. They were expert witnesses presenting precedent. Their ballads and epic poems were meticulously crafted records of past judgments, land grants, and famous disputes, all preserved through complex rhythmic and melodic structures designed to prevent alteration over generations. When a bard stood before a chieftain and his council to sing, he was opening a living legal textbook. He would perform a ballad that detailed a case from generations past, a story of a stolen herd or a contested field, and the ruling that had resolved it. The authority of the verdict rested entirely on the authority of the singer and the perceived accuracy of his performance. A single misremembered detail, a name sung out of place, could undermine the entire argument. But a compelling, flawless performance did more than just recite facts. It transported the entire courtroom. The bard's voice, the driving rhythm of the instrument, and the vivid imagery of the lyrics would make that ancient conflict feel immediate and visceral. The judges were no longer just considering an abstract rule. They were reliving a story where justice had already been served, and they were being invited to follow its example. This practice turned the entire past into a persuasive tool, a chorus of ancestral voices literally sung into the courtroom to argue for a particular verdict, proving that the most durable law was often the kind you could hum. Sometimes the final argument was not an argument at all, but a melody. For an accused individual standing before their judges with all other avenues exhausted, the last hope for salvation could be a song. This was not a casual performance. It was a desperate, calculated plea set to music, a final vocal performance where a life literally hung on the notes produced. The defendant had to make a profound strategic choice, knowing that every element of their song would be dissected for its hidden meaning. Would they choose a defiant, heroic tune? Such a melody might earn a measure of respect for their courage, but in a system that often valued submission to authority, it could also be interpreted as a final confirmation of their guilt and lack of remorse. Or would they choose a sorrowful, penitent melody, one woven with threads of regret and appeals for compassion? This approach was a gamble on the empathy of the judges and the crowd, an attempt to transform their fate from a matter of law into a matter of the heart. The delivery was everything. A voice that cracked with genuine, performative sorrow could sway opinions far more effectively than a list of facts, but a voice that seemed to force the emotion, or that wavered in its musicality, could come across as insincere, sealing their doom. This was the ultimate pressure cooker for a performer, a moment where the aesthetic quality of a melody was inextricably linked to the biological truth of survival. It crystallizes the incredible stakes of ancient legal systems, where the human voice, in its most artistic and vulnerable form, held the direct power to grant life or deliver death. When the law's doors remained closed, the people opened their own court in the streets, with satire as the gavel and song as the judge. Across the ancient world, a cleverly rhymed insult set to a catchy tune could inflict more damage than any formal fine. In ancient Greece, the comic playwrights were masters of this legal weaponry, crafting entire plays where politicians and powerful figures were lampooned by a singing chorus. The audience, sometimes thousands strong, would laugh and sing along, and the melodies would escape the theater, becoming the gossip of the city. A public official accused of greed might find himself trailed by children singing a simple, taunting verse about his hunger for gold. This was not mere entertainment, it was a potent social sanction. The song's infectious nature was its power, a self-propagating verdict that no one could control. Once a melody of mockery took hold in the public imagination, the accused faced a sentence of perpetual humiliation, a punishment that often compelled them to restore what was stolen or change their behavior simply to make the singing stop. This vocal justice bypassed corrupt judges and ignored the wealth of the perpetrator, holding everyone accountable to the same court of public opinion. The true genius of this system lay in its musical design, for a fact set to a forgettable speech could be ignored, but an accusation set to an unforgettable tune became inescapable, ringing in the ears of an entire community until justice was served. A courtroom opponent could be defeated before they even opened their mouth, not by evidence but by a melody sung in the dead of night. This was the realm of the ritual curse, a dark inversion of the legal song where harmonics were weaponized to harm. In societies from ancient Greece to Rome, individuals engaged in bitter lawsuits would sometimes seek out a specialist, a professional curser, to compose and perform a binding incantation against their adversary. These were not simple spoken threats, they were complex compositions, often sung or chanted in a specific rhythm at a specific time, and inscribed on lead tablets that were then buried in graves or thrown down wells, offerings to chthonic gods who enforced the malediction. The target of the curse was not just the person, but their very ability to participate in the trial. A common plea was for the opponent to be struck dumb, for their tongue to be bound, and their arguments to turn to incoherent babble in the courtroom. The power of this practice lay less in supernatural mechanics and more in devastating psychology. Imagine preparing for the most important speech of your life, knowing that a hired vocalist had sung a song intended to rob you of your voice. That knowledge was a poison. It introduced a seed of doubt that could blossom into full-blown fear. As you stood to speak, every dry throat, every momentary stumble over a word would not feel like simple nerves, it would feel like the curse taking hold. Your own voice would become your enemy, its every falter a confirmation of the hex's power. This psychological warfare often became a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the fear of vocal failure created the very failure the curse was meant to achieve, proving that in the ancient courtroom, the most dangerous performance was sometimes the one you never heard. Your word alone was not always enough to seal a promise, but a song you both sang together was unbreakable. Far beyond the formal courtroom, the power of voice and melody was used to forge the very bonds that held societies together. When two tribes needed to create an alliance or when merchants agreed on a major trade route, they did not reach for a parchment and quill. Instead, they composed a song. This joint performance was far more than a celebration. It was the contract itself. The specific melody, the intricate rhythm, the exact sequence of the lyrics, all of these elements combined to form a unique and binding signature. Everyone present would learn and sing the agreement, literally giving it life through their collective breath. This process made the terms unforgettable. You could not easily claim you forgot a clause when it was embedded in a catchy tune that everyone in your village could hum. To violate such an agreement was a profound transgression. It was not merely a breach of contract, it was a betrayal of that shared harmonic moment, a dissonant act against the community's memory. If a dispute later arose about the terms, the elders would not ask for a document. They would demand that both parties reperform the agreement song. This was the ultimate test. Could you and your former partner still sing in harmony? Any hesitation, any deviation from the established melody or lyrics was not seen as a simple mistake. It was glaring evidence of bad faith, a sign that you were trying to alter the terms or that your commitment had faltered. This practice reveals a world where music was not just an art form, it was a fundamental framework for trust and social order. A melody could build a bridge of obligation more durable than any written law. proving that the most binding agreements are sometimes the ones we literally carry in our voices. The final verdict could be a single, thunderous roar from the people. In the popular assemblies of the ancient world, justice was not a quiet pronouncement from a robed judge, but a deafening wave of sound from the crowd. After the arguments were finished, the fate of the accused was placed directly into the hands, or rather the voices, of the entire citizen body. The presiding leader would not count hands or ballots, he would listen. He would calibrate his ears to the quality of the roar that erupted from the assembly. A unified, powerful, and sustained cry for condemnation was an undeniable signal of guilt. But a scattered, hesitant murmur, a collection of conflicting shouts with no harmonic force, was read as a clear vote for acquittal. The volume, the tone, and the sheer cohesion of the sound were the data points for the final judgment. This created a legal environment where the most skilled orators were not just presenting a case, they were conducting a human orchestra. Their entire summation was designed to build toward this climactic moment, using every rhetorical trick to whip the crowd into a unified emotional state, to guide that raw vocal energy toward a single, decisive outcome. A well-timed appeal to patriotism could fuse thousands of individual voices into a weapon of condemnation. A carefully placed sob story could fracture that same crowd into a dissonant and forgiving murmur. This was justice by acoustic measurement, a system where the law's final word was not written, but shouted into existence by the very people it was meant to serve. Yet the human voice in court was not always a weapon or a plea, it could also be a balm. Amid the fiery accusations and the tense swearing of oaths, a different kind of song would sometimes rise, one designed not to condemn or to argue, but to heal. In many traditions, from the councils of Native American tribes to the village gatherings across Africa and Asia, elders or designated mediators used calm, rhythmic chanting or a steady, monotonous singing to de-escalate disputes. They understood that a fight could not be resolved while hearts were still pounding with rage. Their intervention was a form of auditory therapy applied directly to the legal conflict. The mediator's voice, unwavering in its tempo and gentle in its tone, would fill the space. This was a deliberate manipulation of the soundscape. The rhythmic repetition had a physiological effect, subtly synchronizing the breathing of the angry parties, slowing racing heart rates, and dialing down the body's fight or flight response. It created a kind of acoustic bubble, a psychological space insulated from the heat of the argument where compromise could begin to seem possible again. Can you feel the shift? The mediator was not adding another voice to the debate. They were reshaping the very environment in which the debate occurred. Their song acted as a vocal anchor, holding everyone in a shared, calm moment and guiding them away from raw emotional reactions. This proactive, soothing use of the voice reveals an incredibly sophisticated ancient insight, a recognition that the path to a rational settlement was often paved not with more words but with the right kind of sound. Even a simple eyewitness account was sculpted by sound. When you stood to describe what you saw, your memory was not trusted to speak for itself. It had to be shaped into a rhythmic chant. This was not a casual retelling. It was a formalized performance designed to lock the truth into place. The witness would deliver their testimony in a steady, almost musical cadence, a deliberate pattern of words that minimized emotional wavering and eliminated hesitant pauses. This rhythmic structure served as a mental scaffold, helping the witness recall the exact sequence of events without deviation. A story chanted in a consistent beat is far harder to alter on the fly than one spoken freely, where a liar might stumble over new details or contradict themselves. The judges were not just listening to the words, they were listening to the music behind them. Their ears were tuned to the rhythm itself, searching for any subtle break, any fractional stumble in the established pattern. A single misplaced beat, a moment where the chant faltered, was not seen as a simple slip of the tongue. It was a red flag, a potential signal of fabrication or a gap in genuine memory. In this system, the raw, chaotic experience of an event was transformed into a structured, repeatable performance. The truth was not just in what you said, but in how steadily you could sing it. This practice reveals a profound belief that a perfectly controlled voice was the most reliable vessel for a perfect memory, turning every witness into a composer of their own verified past. A landscape could be legally owned not by a piece of paper but by a song. For countless cultures deeply intertwined with their environment, the most important maps and property deeds were not drawn on parchment but composed in melody. These were not simple folk songs, they were complex legal documents, meticulously crafted to encode every critical detail of a territory into a lyrical and rhythmic structure. A title deed song would describe the precise path of a boundary, naming specific ancient trees, unusual rock formations, and the bends of rivers as its permanent markers. It would catalog the resources like a particular grove of nut trees or a seasonal berry patch, weaving this practical information into the narrative of the song. This was a living archive, and its sole custodians were the voices of the people who inherited it. When a dispute over land arose, the courtroom test was not about producing a signed charter, it was a performance. The true owner was the individual who could stand before the elders and sing the entire song from beginning to end without a single error. The melody and rhythm served as a mnemonic lock, a sophisticated system that prevented the details from being altered or forgotten over generations. To change a single word was to break the rhythm, to misremember a landmark was to sing a wrong note. A claimant who stumbled over the sequence, who hesitated at the description of the old oak by the stream, was not just having a memory lapse, they were demonstrating a fatal lack of connection to the land in question. Their case would crumble not on a technicality, but on the music itself. This practice meant the law was literally sung into the soil, with the human voice acting as the unbreakable thread linking a people to their home, a permanent and resonant title etched into the air itself. A single cracked note could shatter your entire defense. The ancient courtroom was a stage where vocal perfection was demanded, and any failure was treated not as a simple mistake, but as legal evidence. If a litigant's voice gave out from a sudden illness, or if a crucial witness forgot the melody to a testimony song, the case could be lost in that moment. Such a mishap was rarely met with sympathy. Instead, it was interpreted as a divine sign, a clear indication that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the speaker. A voice that faltered under the immense pressure of the proceedings was seen as the audible manifestation of a weak character or a guilty conscience. Historical records from places like ancient Greece mention disputes over property where one party, after fumbling the rhythmic chant of a boundary description, simply conceded. They understood that no amount of factual argument could overcome the powerful, silent message of that vocal failure. The performance was the proof. To stand before the judges and produce a weak, trembling sound was to demonstrate a fundamental lack of conviction in your own cause. This created a legal environment where the risk was paralyzing. Many were advised to settle their disputes out of court, not because their case was weak, but because they feared their own voice might betray them at the pivotal moment. In this world, your vocal cords were as much a legal instrument as any contract, and their failure in performance carried a direct and often devastating price. The roar of the crowd and the defendant's final, desperate song were gradually silenced by the quiet rustle of parchment. As empires expanded and administrations grew more complex, justice could no longer rely solely on the memory of bards or the emotional impact of a well-delivered lament. The Roman Republic, with its fiery orators dominating the forum, gave way to the vast bureaucratic machinery of the empire. In this new system, a case was not won with a thundering voice that moved thousands, but with a meticulously drafted document that could be filed, stamped, and archived. The law was moving from the public square into the scribe's office. This was a profound transformation of the entire legal landscape. The skills that once guaranteed victory, a powerful vocal delivery, and the ability to compose a compelling rhythmic testimony were suddenly devalued. A farmer who could beautifully sing the boundaries of his land from memory now found himself at a disadvantage against a wealthy neighbor who could produce a written deed, even if that deed was newly crafted and questionable. The very definition of legal expertise changed. It was no longer the charismatic performer who held sway, but the literate specialist who could navigate the growing labyrinth of written codes and imperial rescripts. This new legal professional, the jurist, dealt in a silent currency of text. His power came from his ability to read, interpret, and write, skills that were often inaccessible to the common person. The courtroom itself began to change, its architecture shifting from acoustically perfect amphitheaters designed for public hearing to smaller, more administrative spaces where arguments were submitted in writing and judges deliberated in silence over stacks of papyrus. This was the great divorce between sound and law. The human voice, once the supreme instrument of legal persuasion, was being pushed to the margins, its power fading with every new line of written code. The ear, for so long the primary judge of truth, was being supplanted by the eye. Can you feel the magnitude of that shift? It redefined not just how justice was administered, but how truth itself was perceived, moving it from a performance felt in the body to a text analyzed by the mind. The written word may have claimed the courtroom, but the human voice never truly surrendered the stage. Look closely at a modern trial, and you will see the ghost of ancient vocal power lingering in the shadows of legal procedure. The dramatic closing argument delivered by a skilled trial lawyer is not merely a summary of facts, it is a performance steeped in ancient tradition. Its careful modulation of tone, its strategic pauses, and its emotional crescendos are the direct descendants of the techniques perfected by orators like Cicero, designed not just to inform a jury, but to move them toward a verdict. The law may be written in books, but its final persuasion still happens in the air between the lawyer's lips and the jury's ears. Even the concept of witness demeanor, a formal instruction given to every jury, instructs them to pay attention to how something is said. The hesitation before an answer, the tremor in a voice, the shift from confidence to uncertainty, these vocal cues are still weighed as potential evidence of truthfulness or deception. We have simply swapped the sacred melody for a nervous tone, and then there is the oath, that mumbled promise to tell the truth we often see as a procedural formality. Placing a hand on a Bible and speaking a vow is the faint, secular echo of a time when a chanted oath was a binding contract with the divine, and the sound of your voice delivering it was the ultimate test of your character. Recognizing this long history does more than satisfy our curiosity. It reveals that beneath the cold surface of modern law, the ancient, resonant heartbeat of performed justice still faintly pulses. His choice of words became a death sentence. In the year 399 before the Common Era, the most famous trial in history unfolded not through written evidence, but through a clash of vocal styles, a battle of sounds that would echo for millennia. Socrates, the philosopher, stood accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and disrespecting its gods. He was a master of a specific kind of speech, the dialectic, a method built on relentless questioning and logical dissection. When he faced the 501 jurors of the Athenian court, he had a choice. He could adopt the expected tone of a defendant, one of humility and emotional appeal, weaving a flattering narrative to win the jury's sympathy. Or he could be true to his own voice. He chose the latter. His defense was a performance of pure, unadulterated reason. He did not beg for his life. He challenged his accusers. He dissected their charges with logical precision, exposing contradictions and flaws in their arguments. His voice was likely calm, steady, and intellectually arrogant, the sound of a teacher correcting misguided students rather than a man fighting for his life. This vocal persona was a direct affront to the court's unwritten rules. The jury was not there just to be informed. They were there to be moved, to be emotionally swayed. Socrates gave them cold logic when they expected warm, performative emotion. His accusers, Anytus and Meletus, understood this perfectly. They almost certainly employed the kind of traditional, emotive rhetoric the jurors understood. They would have used a charged tone, building a narrative of moral panic, painting Socrates not just as a wrongdoer, but as a corrosive force threatening the very soul of the city. Their voices would have been weapons of fear and outrage, skillfully manipulating the collective mood in that vast, open-air court. Socrates' famous refusal to perform, his conscious rejection of persuasive vocal conventions, was seen as arrogance. It was interpreted not as integrity, but as a deep disrespect for the court and the city itself. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was death. In the end, the man celebrated as the wisest in Athens was condemned not merely for his ideas, but for the sound of the voice that defended them, a stark lesson that in an ancient courtroom, truth could be a weaker defense than a compelling performance. A man's life could depend on the strength of his lungs and the clarity of his words in the open air. This was the reality in the Germanic thing, a gathering that was both parliament and supreme court, held in a sacred grove or a level field. Here, every free man had not just a right but a duty to attend and to voice his judgment. There were no stone walls to amplify sound, no written laws to consult. The entire legal process unfolded in the raw, unassisted human voice. A plaintiff had to stand before the entire assembly and project his accusation with enough force and conviction to reach the ears of hundreds. A weak, faltering delivery was not just a tactical failure, it was a moral one. It suggested a weak case or a lack of conviction, and it could lead to his grievance being literally drowned out by the sounds of the wind or the murmurs of the crowd. The laws themselves were not documents. They were a living repertoire carried in the memory of the law speaker, a respected elder who would stand and recite the entire legal code from beginning to end, his voice giving tangible form to the rules that bound the community. His recitation was not a dry monologue, it was a rhythmic, formal chant. This musical structure was deliberate, a mnemonic technology that transformed abstract rules into a memorable, almost musical score. The cadence and repetition made the laws stick in the minds of all who heard them, ensuring they could be recalled and applied correctly in future disputes. When a verdict was reached, it was not written down and filed away. The judgment was proclaimed aloud, a powerful vocal act that made the decision real and binding. To hear the sentence spoken with the full force of the assembly's authority was to witness justice being voiced into existence. The thing was a legal world built entirely from sound, a resonant proof that for centuries the law was not something you read, but something you heard and participated in creating with your own voice. We can now understand the secret power behind these ancient performances because modern neuroscience reveals why they worked so well. The human brain is hardwired to process the music of the human voice, an element known as prosody. This is the natural rhythm, stress, and melody of our speech, and our brains are exquisitely tuned to it. A voice that is steady, deep, and resonant does more than just convey information. It triggers a subconscious response in the listener, associating those vocal qualities with authority, confidence, and truthfulness. This is the scientific basis for why a trembling voice implied guilt. Your ancient brain was picking up on a signal of uncertainty and stress. But the influence of sound goes even deeper, especially when it comes to music. When a group of people sings or chants together in rhythm, something remarkable happens in their brains. Their brainwave patterns can begin to synchronize. This neural alignment creates a powerful sense of unity and shared purpose, a feeling of being part of a single tribe. A skilled orator or a singer leading a legal hymn was, in effect, conducting the neural activity of the jury, fusing them into a cohesive unit more likely to arrive at a collective verdict. Furthermore, the repetitive, rhythmic nature of chanting and singing serves a dual purpose. It acts as a powerful mnemonic device, locking information into long-term memory through its predictable patterns. But it also has a more subtle effect. It can lower our conscious critical resistance. A flowing, melodic presentation is easier for the brain to process and accept, bypassing some of the analytical skepticism that a dry, factual statement might trigger. The ancient legal masters knew nothing of neurons or brain waves, but through centuries of trial and error, they perfected a set of auditory tools that tapped directly into the most fundamental pathways of human psychology. Their courtrooms were not just venues for argument, they were sophisticated environments for acoustic persuasion, where the right sound could feel indistinguishable from the truth itself. Your future in court depended on the strength of your daily vocal exercises. In Rome, a young man destined for a public life did not just study law, he apprenticed himself to a rhetorician, a master of the spoken word. Their training grounds were not quiet libraries, but open fields and echoing seashores, where they would practice projecting their voices against the wind, learning to make a single sentence carry to the farthest listener without ever seeming to shout. They drilled in breath control, learning to sustain a long, complex argument without a gasp for air that might betray weakness. Most importantly, they practiced emotional modulation, reciting the same passage with tones of righteous anger, heartfelt sorrow, or cool logic, understanding that the case itself could be won or lost based on which emotional key they chose to play. This was not acting in the modern sense. It was the cultivation of a persuasive persona, the forging of the voice itself into a precise and reliable legal instrument. In cultures where law was sung, the training began in childhood. A child would not simply hear the old ballads and deed songs. They would be required to learn them by heart, note for note, word for word. The specific melodic phrases that described a land boundary or the rhythmic patterns used to accuse someone of theft were as fundamental to their education as learning to count or farm. A mistake in performance was not just an artistic failure, it was a potential future legal catastrophe. This knowledge was a form of social armor, the primary means by which an individual, often without the aid of a professional advocate, could stand before their community and assert their rights. The widespread nature of this training meant that the average citizen possessed a vocal competence we would find astonishing today. They were all, in a sense, part-time performers, because performance was the price of participation in civic life. As written law slowly displaced oral tradition, this essential motivation for vocal training evaporated. Why spend years mastering the subtle art of the lament or the rhythmic chant when a scribe could write your petition for you? The specialized skill of the orator became the hobby of the elite, and the universal human right to speak for oneself in court was gradually outsourced to the professionals who could read the new, silent language of the law. We gained efficiency and precision, but we lost an era where every person's voice was their most powerful legal tool. The resonant halls of justice were often a space where only male voices were permitted to echo. In the official courtrooms of ancient Rome, classical Athens, and many other patriarchal societies, a woman's direct testimony was legally invalid. Her legal voice was not her own. It had to be filtered through the speech of her father, husband, or a male guardian who would present her case to the judges. This formal silencing was rooted in deep-seated cultural beliefs that viewed female speech in public, legal settings as disruptive, untrustworthy, or simply illegitimate. A woman's perspective, her account of events, her very truth, had no official standing unless it was translated and delivered by a man. Yet, this systematic exclusion did not mean women were powerless. It forced them to become masters of an alternative, acoustic form of justice. When the courthouse doors were barred, they took their cases to the court of public opinion, and their primary tool was the lament. This was not a private cry, but a public performance of grief and accusation, a sonic weapon wielded with precision. A woman wronged would compose a song detailing her loss, naming her oppressor, and she would perform it at the city gates, in the marketplace, or outside the home of the powerful. Her vocal skill was her evidence, the raw, authentic emotion in her trembling melody serving as undeniable proof of her suffering. A compelling lament could mobilize the entire community, creating a tide of social shame and moral pressure that no official verdict could match. It forced elders or leaders to intervene, not because the law required it, but because the sound of her voice made inaction impossible. This created a parallel legal system, one driven by female voices that used the power of song to bend the rigid formal rules, proving that even when silenced by statute, the human voice finds a way to sing its truth. This same reliance on the voice as a legal instrument echoed across the continents, a universal human response to the need for order. In Scandinavia, Viking skalds engaged in poetic duels known as flyting, a formal verbal combat where insults and accusations were woven into complex, improvised verse. A successful flyting performance, rich with clever metaphors and biting wit, could publicly humiliate an opponent into submission, settling a dispute over property or honor without a single blow being struck. The victor was not necessarily the one with the stronger arm, but the one with the sharper tongue and the more commanding vocal delivery. Meanwhile, across vast regions of Africa, communities developed the practice of drumming the news. Specific rhythmic patterns played on talking drums could communicate intricate messages across great distances, broadcasting grievances and accusations to the entire village. A particular sequence of beats might announce a theft, naming the accused and calling for a gathering to hear the case. This transformed the soundscape of the community itself into a courtroom, where the very air carried the formalities of justice. These diverse practices, from the icy north to the equatorial forests, all point to a shared human intuition. Our ancestors understood that justice is not merely a dry, logical concept to be analyzed in silence. It is an experience, a social ritual that must be felt and heard to be fully realized. The resonant power of a chant, the compelling rhythm of a drum, the biting cadence of an insulting poem. These sounds did not just describe the law, they actively performed it, shaping the social reality of right and wrong in a way that a silent document never could. This global tapestry of sonic justice reveals a profound truth we are only now rediscovering, that the human voice was the world's first and most universal legal code. The same power that sang justice into existence could also sing a lie into truth. A legal system built on the persuasive force of voice and song carried a profound and unsettling risk, one the ancients recognized with startling clarity. Was it truly just for a person's fate to depend on the beauty of their lament or the steadiness of their oath song, rather than on silent, verifiable facts? This system was not a meritocracy of evidence, but an aristocracy of vocal talent. It inherently favored the individual with a natural gift for oratory, the family wealthy enough to afford vocal training, or the person charismatic enough to command a room. A guilty man with a silver tongue and a commanding presence could sway a jury to tears, while an innocent but inarticulate farmer, his voice rough and trembling from a life of labor, might see his truthful case crumble under the weight of his own poor performance. The emotions stirred by a powerful performance were the point, but they were also the problem. A heart-wrenching song could cloud a jury's ability to discern fact from feeling, leading to verdicts based on manipulated sympathy rather than cold, hard reality. The Greek philosopher Plato saw this danger with terrifying foresight. He warned his students against the sophists, teachers of rhetoric who, in his view, cared nothing for truth and everything for victory. He saw their art as a kind of culinary flattery, a way of seasoning a false argument to make it as pleasing and palatable as a true one. For Plato, a legal system dominated by such persuasive sound was a sickness in the soul of the state, because it trained citizens to value the appearance of justice over justice itself. This ancient ethical dilemma echoes directly into our own courtrooms today. We still grapple with the tension between a lawyer's dramatic closing argument and the dry facts of the case, between the charismatic witness and the nervous one. The core question remains unresolved. Where should we draw the line between the legitimate power of persuasion and the pure, unadorned pursuit of what actually happened? The ghost of the ancient singer still stands before the bench, reminding us that the most compelling sound in the world is not always the sound of truth. Our journey through these resonant courtrooms reveals a justice system alive with sound, a world where the human voice in all its forms was a fundamental instrument of the law. From the persuasive rhetoric of an Athenian orator to the binding melody of a tribal agreement, sound actively shaped fates, preserved histories, and maintained the very fabric of social order. It was a system built on the belief that truth was not just heard but felt in the bones. While our modern legal systems have largely traded the sensitive ear for the scrutinizing eye, favoring the silent language of text, the echoes of this sonic justice are never entirely silenced. You can still hear its faint pulse in the dramatic cadence of a compelling closing argument, and in the way a jury instinctively weighs the tremor in a witness's tone. This exploration reminds us that the law has never been a sterile, abstract concept. It has always been a deeply human, and therefore a deeply sensory endeavor. We would love to hear your thoughts on this fascinating intersection of history, law, and music in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more explorations into the enduring mysteries of our past.